Hi everyone. So I am back with the little bit more, I guess, standard at this point, video lectures, and what I intended for this one to be, and what it is going to be about, is one of the big action areas for the United Nations is in peacekeeping. And the United Nations does a lot, and I think there's still a sentiment in the United States that UN doesn't really do anything. Uh, that's not true. And one of the easiest places to look to see what the UN does is in peacekeeping, because it does relate to international security. The UN does a lot of things in a lot of other areas as well. This is going to take a look at some of the humanitarian interventions that have gone on, sometimes alongside and sometimes in addition to those peacekeeping operations. But that's another big kind of action-oriented area where people can, I think, see the UN in action. There are other things too, a lot on the research end, a lot on the discussion end that the UN also does. The role of Secretary General in negotiating or trying to negotiate more peaceful relations between and among countries is a role. A lot of that was described in the lecture notes that I posted in lieu of a lecture video on Monday, because I felt like just giving you the notes made more sense than talking at you. In this one, though, there are some maps, and even if it's just as little as Google Maps, I would like to survey a lot of the places where the UN has operated in relatively recent times. I'm kind of still focused on the big switch from the Cold War to the post-Cold War world, because during the Cold War, there was not a whole lot of the complex peacekeeping stuff. Now, these terms were explained in the textbook, and they were also introduced in the previous lecture. But there are broadly two types of peacekeeping operations that the UN does. Uh, one kind is referred to as the simple or first generation peacekeeping, and the other is the more complex, sometimes called multi-dimensional, sometimes called second generation peacekeeping. There are a number of terms, but it's the same idea. The first generation stuff, simple, if there's ever simple peacekeeping, that is usually, that's the actual peacekeeping bit, where there is a peace to keep. Frequently, the individuals who are brought in to observe ceasefires that have been negotiated in wars between states, and they are there as the honest broker, the referee, whatever you want to call it, to monitor ceasefires and to ensure that all sides to a conflict are living up to it. They tend to be small in number, very lightly armed, and they operate with the consent of the states concerned. Multidimensional or complex peacekeeping, as you'll recall, is, well, it's a lot more than that, and it tends to happen, not always, but it tends to happen more in response to civil wars, ethnic conflict, some of the topics we talked about previously in the course. But internal war is where we tend to see these more complex operations. Because there is a civil war going on, some of the functions of states frequently break down. It creates humanitarian and governance crises. And the UN frequently, though not always, steps in to try to address several of those crises. However, intervening in those kind of situations also presents security risks to those who are, say, trying to get food, water, shelter to folks who might die otherwise without it. And so frequently, peacekeepers are sent in to allow these more humanitarian oriented operations to take place. There's more to it than that. A lot of times these complex peacekeeping operations, they have the human rights monitoring component. Many times they'll also have a kind of political development arm. The UN has in the past been very interested in holding elections in those complex peacekeeping operations in countries where perhaps the old government was overthrown or became capable of ruling. The UN wanted to set up an interim government and get out as quick as possible. That was the thinking for a while, until they realized that sometimes getting out as fast as possible means the UN gets out before a new government is ready to govern or able to govern. But those are whatever. I don't want to get too far off the track there. But I did want to remind you of the differences between simple first-generation peacekeeping operations and the second-generation or more complex or multi-dimensional peacekeeping operations. All right, and back to the outline that we have here. I'll get into it so that this doesn't have to take longer than it does. While the Cold War is still going on, the UN, it will carry out peacekeeping operations. In fact, the standard peacekeeping operations are here. You can see 1948 to 2020. And so if we look at if we look at this column, everything in this column up and down, we notice that up through 1978, it's just this many. And then right around 1988, just as the Cold War is about to come to an end, we see a rash of peacekeeping operations take off. And again, compare it to the, 3 decades that came before, which occupy these top maybe, 10. And then in the 5 years after that, or 7 years after that, we have all of these, of course, right on up to today. You'll notice that the pace of new peacekeeping operations has slowed fairly considerably from what we saw in the very late 1980s through the actually, I would just say throughout the 1990s. I mean, just all of these operations that are going on. We have some of these that are starting in the same month as one another. Anyhow, these first several ones are not standard peacekeeping operations. There aren't troops sent in, not UN peacekeepers that are sent in, but instead these are humanitarian interventions. And the first one, it's pretty standard to see what the issue was. It is the famine in the Sahel region, 1973 to 1974. Various UN agencies, as well as a host of non-UN, non-governmental organizations, tried to coordinate a response to the famine that was affecting the population in that region. And this was unlike other operations to date, if we're talking about the early 70s. And the reason why it was different is that this was a kind of slow onset crisis, this famine in the Sahel. It wasn't as if a civil war or a bout of ethnic cleansing, before the term even existed, was taking place. These famines, they tend to develop over time. And so the United Nations, the World Food Program, the Food and Agriculture Organization, those are some of the UN-affiliated agencies that were working alongside non-governmental organizations to try to provide relief. However, the effort, perhaps because it was the first, it was not well organized. one observer noted, the collective effort of the international community suffered from poor information, poor logistical capacity, and a disregard for the consequences of action. End quote. Just because one intervenes does not mean one is going to be successful. And in the previous lecture on international intervention, I don't think I hammered that point home enough, but it is an observation. The decision to intervene is usually a much easier decision to make than it is to experience success in an intervention beyond a state, or in this case, an IGO doesn't really have borders. It's borders. About a decade later, in Ethiopia, just to give ourselves some reference here. So here we have Ethiopia. A decade later, 1983, 1985, there was yet another famine, but this time it was in Ethiopia. The death toll was shocking to the world at the time. It really garnered a lot of international attention. 1 million dead as a result of the Ethiopian famine. And it was the impetus for the July 13th, 1985 Live Aid concert. And that is kind of remembered as the beginning of the celebrity promotion and endorsement of humanitarian causes. I mean, since then, celebrities like Bono have gotten involved in various causes. Brad Pitt, Angelina Jolie were really involved in the Darfur genocide several years after this. About 15 years ago now. It was one of the major causes. So, yeah, humanitarian crises, humanitarian interventions as an occasion for celebrities to get involved and to use their celebrity to draw attention to things that they believe need the attention. That precedent is set in that Ethiopian famine. Doctors Without Borders, it's not a UN agency, it's an independent organization. It's one of those non-governmental organizations. Ends up getting expelled by the Ethiopian government because it refuses to keep silent about government atrocities and the government policy of ethnic cleansing by Ethiopia. So that was by the death toll, despite the sums raised by events like the Live Aid. I won't say that it was too little too late, but it was not enough to provide relief to all those who need it. And it's going to end up having an effect on Ethiopia's neighbor and frequent rival, Somalia. I talked about the Ogaden War in the late 1970s in a previous lecture. And the famine that takes place in Ethiopia also hits Somalia quite hard, and it's one of the contributing factors to the downfall and collapse of the Somali state. But that's still a few years off at this point. Shifting gears a bit, about the same time the concerns about Ethiopia and the famine are going on, remember what's also happening. Well, there's a lot happening in the 1980s. We've talked about the story of Afghanistan in the past in the 80s. Remember, the Soviets get involved back when this was Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan were part of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was getting involved in Afghanistan because it was trying to prop up a friendly government there that was facing an insurgency and losing. And the Soviet counterinsurgency strategy, which was You know, it was strapped for manpower, and the Soviets pretty much took a position of shooting almost anything that moved in many parts of the country to displace civilians who were aiding the insurgents. And so, because of the attacks on civilians, you had a lot of Afghanis move into Pakistan. I mean, they fled the violence and ended up settling in refugee camps inside of Pakistan. It was a lot to ask for the Pakistani government to provide that kind of support to such a large and long-lasting refugee population. And so there was a pretty big push by the UN and by other independent humanitarian action to get involved and to provide relief to those refugees. So you had groups like Catholic Relief Services, Care International, the International Committee of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Society. That's right. We largely refer to just the Red Cross here. But it was welcomed, at least by the United States, which has been and still is a major contributor to the United Nations budget, because the United States was opposed to the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan and wanted to see that it would fail. And the folks who were fleeing the Soviet violence in Pakistan had the same enemies or rivals as the United States. And so the U.S. saw this intervention as not necessarily a bad thing. And in a lot of these Cold War conflicts, it was something I started mentioning at the beginning of the lecture, but I didn't finish the point. A lot of times the Security Council, and so this is our list of what actually happened, was kept from authorizing peacekeeping operations because either the United States or the Soviet Union or both or another one of the permanent members of the Security Council saw possible relief efforts or peacekeeping efforts as helping the other side. Right? So if it was the communist world, it was helping the non-communist world. If it was the non-communist world, other missions might be viewed as helping the communist world. And so they went nowhere in the UN, and that's why there were that's an explanation why there were relatively few peacekeeping operations that were authorized for much of the Cold War. So the relief for Afghanistan, it's largely carried out inside of Pakistan, where there are these refugee camps, and that's happening throughout the 1980s. Finally, we have UN Operation Lifeline Sudan. So Sudan, it's kind of back in this other area that sees its own fair amount of conflict. So this is Sudan. South Sudan, remember, was part of Sudan. South Sudan is actually the newest member of the United Nations. Excuse me. But Operation Lifeline Sudan was a massive relief effort that was led by the United Nations office that was stationed in Nairobi, Kenya. So Kenya is down here. Shares a border in the northwest with what was then part of Sudan. In this particular operation, it was the United Nations Children's Fund, or UNICEF, which some people are familiar with because of charitable actions here in the United States. UNICEF led the Operation Lifeline Sudan, and it was joined by other parts of the UN humanitarian system, the World Food Program, the United Nations Development Program, a number of non-UN, non-governmental organizations, Red Cross, for example. or the International Committee of the Red Cross. That intervention in Sudan was interesting because in it, those who were providing the aid asked for and got guarantees of certain spaces where humanitarians could go without being attacked, or at least with less chance of being attacked than if they went elsewhere. These were known as the corridors of tranquility. It's a little odd sounding, I guess, but they were there. And that idea that war zones could allocate some spaces, maybe fixed spaces, for the relief efforts, humanitarian relief efforts, that was something fairly new and different when it comes to international and UN-led humanitarian operations. All right, I want to focus mostly on the post-Cold War humanitarian interventions, and any list would be selective, but I tried to boil it down to the big ones. Again, not every peacekeeping operation is a humanitarian intervention, and not every humanitarian intervention is necessarily a peacekeeping operation. I'm trying to focus on those things that frequently involve both peacekeeping operation along with a humanitarian component. So first up on our list is the actions in Iraq. And the UN's role in this is largely in the 1990s, 1990 and 1991. And this goes back to kind of the other conflict that was going on. If you were Iran in the 1980s, you had the Soviets in Afghanistan to your northeast and east. And Iran itself was involved in a war with Iraq, much of it along their border, particularly towards the south. And the two conflicts largely overlapped and went just about the entire decade of the 1980s. Saddam Hussein had, this is in neighboring Iraq, had previously taken power, and he tried to bring some Kurdish officers. So a little bit about Iraq, very briefly. In the northern part of the country, then you have a largely Kurdish population. In and around Baghdad and a fair amount of the area west of it, you have a largely Sunni Muslim, and then the area largely from Baghdad southeast to Basra and the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Gulf. That's where you have the majority of the population, the Shia. Now, there are exceptions to those rules. Those are generalities. Saddam Hussein was a Sunni, and that was about 20% of the country's population. Did try to incorporate some of the Kurds, who make up a little bit less than 20% of the population. And he waged war in Iran because he saw an opportunity there because of the weaknesses due to the Iranian Revolution, which turned out to be not quite the weaknesses he thought that they were. So the Iran-Iraq war is going on throughout the 80s. There are Kurds on both sides of the border. There's Kurds in Iraq. There's Kurds in Iran. Iraq tried to use Iran's Kurds against them because the Iranian government had problems with its Kurds. The Iranians tried to get both the Kurds in the north and the Shia Muslims in the south to rise up against the Sunni government in Iraq. Those efforts, by and large, failed on both sides and on all accounts. Nonetheless, as the war came to an end, and short version is that Iraq won, Saddam Hussein begins in 1988 what's known as the Anfal campaign, and that's primarily against the Kurdish population in the north. It's going to include the use of chemical weapons. Estimates of the total dead as a result of that, 200,000 might have been killed by Hussein's forces, right? This is Iraqi on Iraqi violence. And of those 200,000, perhaps 10,000 were killed by Saddam's use of chemical weapons. The role of the UN in all of this. So the UN responds to this situation in Iraq with a number of resolutions. Resolution 687, which ended the First Persian Gulf War, imposed post-war conditions related to sanctions and arms control, and Resolution 688 authorized the reversal of Iraq's policy against the Kurds in the north. Resolution 688 is notable because it's the first time that a humanitarian threat was declared a threat to international peace and security. So it is something that is new and different. In that operation, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, were aiding the United Nations missions effort and ended up working on both sides of the border. So that's on the Iraqi side of the border as well as the Turkish side of the border. If you know the region, there's also a lot of Kurds in here in general, and it is in general. You got a lot of Kurdish population in this area of the Middle East, and that's in 4 countries: Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. They're not the only ones, but those are the major. That is the major concentration. So there were these humanitarian organizations, UN and non-governmental, excuse me, who worked both in Turkey and in northern Iraq. We also saw here something that was pretty new, was the development-oriented non-governmental organizations were carrying out their work in active war zones. And this is indicative of the blurring of labels in the post-war world, post-Cold War world. The distinctions which we think of between war and peace seemed a bit clearer than they were now. And these and other distinctions seem to be breaking down in the face of reality. Longer term, because the UN's efforts in Iraq here were still viewed as rather uncoordinated, it led the United Nations to pass Resolution 4682, which created the Department of Humanitarian Affairs, which was later to become the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And so it would try to do better next time around. Well, what is next time around? Next time around is Somalia, which gets started just as the UN's operations are breaking down in Iraq. So remember where we are. We are back. I said we'd be back to Somalia, and here we are. Remember, Somalia's got This part's got the so-called Horn of Africa, but it also then comes back to the west a bit until it meets its neighbor here, Djibouti, and it's Somalia, Djibouti, and Eritrea combined to keep Ethiopia from having an outlet to. Yeah, we're not taking directions to the Gulf of Aden, but which deny Ethiopia access to the world's oceans and cause it to be a landlocked country. In any event, in Somalia, where there are going to be a number of operations, and it's easy to get lost in the alphabet soup of all the different operations that are going on. They're going to be going on throughout the early to mid 1990s. What happened was that famine, I talked about previously, it spilled over into Somalia from Ethiopia, and it affected about 4 million out of the country's total of 6 million people. And the central government in Somalia collapsed right around the turn of the decade, from the 1980s to the 1990s. And so there's these kind of twin failures. There's the humanitarian, the slow-moving humanitarian crisis of a famine that was coupled with complete political collapse. And so UN and non-governmental agencies, in many instances, were the only sorts of authority who were providing anything to people following the state's collapse in 1990, 1991. Several non-governmental organizations remained and were only able to continue to do their work by paying what we call warlords for protection money. Without getting too much into the alphabet soup of all the operations in Somalia, suffice it to say that there was a UN-based humanitarian operation to provide food and other humanitarian support to those who are living in the famine region. Alongside of that, the U.S., the United States of America, was running its own operation, which was designed to assist the UN humanitarian effort by having U.S. military forces attack the so-called warlords, who were, in many cases, extorting, manipulating the aid that international agencies were trying to get to people in a famine. The effort in Somalia, see if this sounds familiar, was another real challenge for the UN to coordinate. The complexity of Somalia's status really confounded the UN's attempt at coordinating the relief activities of the 33 different countries who tried to participate in the humanitarian intervention. The military effort that the United States leads ends up having, as so many political actions do, unintended consequences. So remember, the reason there was to protect aid convoys from harassment or worse by various bands of armed fighters. One of their tactics in Somalia was to go after individual warlords or leaders. And there was one such raid that went on. The capital of Somalia is Mogadishu, where the U.S. was trying to capture who was widely regarded as the kind of top warlord in Somalia, a guy named Mohammed Adid. And it ended up being a blunder, and the Black Hawk helicopter that certain folks were using ended up getting shot down. Anyways, it goes on to become a Hollywood movie, a book. This is the Black Hawk Down scenario. You can watch and read that on your own, but it's the consequence of that that stings the UN a bit, which is that Black Hawk Down stuff happens on President Clinton's watch, and this operation had begun under his predecessor, George H.W. Bush, and there's a really negative reaction by the American public to what happened to American servicemen in Somalia. And it's going to lead Clinton to issue Presidential Directive 25, which says going forward, the United States is only going to partner on these kind of humanitarian interventions if there's a vital national interest of the United States at stake. If there isn't, he's not going to do it. That's not binding on subsequent administrations, but he's going to be in office till January of 2001. He doesn't know that yet in his first term, but we now know that. And so what that means for the UN is that the world superpower has pretty much said, you're not going to get any military protection from us in the future if we try to do any of these humanitarian interventions with peacekeepers, if the U.S. doesn't see any direct interest of its own to kind of prod it to act. So I realized in this set of notes that I forgot to mention a really important one, so I'll do it now. During the Cold War, and just back up a little bit, the end of the First World War was really an impetus for the creation of an interesting entity known as Yugoslavia, and it combined several present-day countries into one. So this is where we are again. We're in Europe. And Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Slovenia, Montenegro, Kosovo's, whatever its status is complicated today. Is it a country? Is it a state? Is it not? Well, it was certainly then part of Serbia. All this was part of Yugoslavia. You had lots of different groups who lived in the same country. Albania was separate, but there you had it. I guess the short version of what happens in Yugoslavia is there's a lot of economic pressure in the 1980s, loans and so forth that are coming due, and there's a rise in ethnic tensions among the various ethnic groups. So again, you got Serbians, you got Montenegrins, you have Kosovar Albanians, right? Because this is Kosovo, this is Albania, two different countries. You have Bosnians, Croatians, Slovenes. So you got a number of different ethnic groups, and a lot of them were fairly interspersed throughout Yugoslavia. You had a lot of mixed communities. Well, tensions arose. The Slovenes really pushed for their own independence and to break away from Yugoslavia. Other republics then followed the attempt of Slovenia to break away. and really it was kind of Serbia that was left holding the bag to try to hold Yugoslavia together. And when that seemed unable, the Serbs, like others, tried to gather as much territory as they could. And because you have a lot of mixed areas, what many sides did, if not all of them, is they engaged in attacks against civilians to try to ethnically cleanse those areas of civilians of the other type. So Croats perhaps doing it to Bosnians to create Croat areas, and Serbs doing it to Bosnians, Bosnians doing it to Serbs, and so on. Now that this was happening in Europe, right, the other conflicts so far, Middle East, Southwest Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, these things happen, and there's some efforts. They may succeed, they may fail, but now this is a fairly big deal. This is happening as the Cold War has just come to an end. There's still the question of how to unify, or whether to unify Germany. Germany had not been unified yet. And the possibility of refugees streaming into Western Europe is something that a lot of those democratic governments did not want. So there was interest in putting an end to this. But again, there were compromises made, and there were unintended consequences. On the one hand, a number of democracies, including the United States, wanted to see an end to the ethnic conflict, and ironically intervened to protect a lot of Muslims, including Kosovo Albanians, among others, from attacks by usually Orthodox Christians or sometimes Catholic Christians. There's a strange dynamic where majority Christian countries were taking the sides of their non-co-religionists against their co-religionists. But that was the 1990s. Those kind of things could and did happen. So while there was an interest in intervening to protect minority groups from abuses by larger, Serbia was the most militarily powerful. It was really Serbs who were the backbone of the Yugoslav army. While the democracies were interested in doing that kind of protection and putting an end to ethnic cleansing and so on, they didn't want to take a lot of casualties to do it. And so that led NATO and the United States to engage in a very long-running bombing campaign against Serbia, and it ended up targeting a number of civilian installations, communications networks, power generation, hospitals, roads, other things. Post-war analysis suggested that a low estimate that probably 200,000 civilians had died in Serbia as a result of the NATO bombing campaign, really raised questions about, well, how humanitarian is this? And what are the ethics of killing civilians in one country to possibly save civilians in another area? Which was a difficult question, but it was politically required, because putting troops on the ground, which would have in many ways allowed for greater discrimination between combatants and civilians, and ideally fewer civilian casualties, but it also would have meant higher Western European and American casualties, which their political leaders believed that their people could not stomach. And so, as a result, among others, the civilians of some of the offending countries ended up paying the price for the political leadership and the actions of the military. Moreover, by choosing to go up high rather than on the ground, the Air Force was frequently unable to put an end to the killing, which really required ground forces that the United States and others were unwilling to provide because they were so cost conscious. So you ended up having a lot of civilian casualties created by intervention and UN and NATO-led efforts, and they're unable to stop the negative actions that they are trying to stop. Moreover, when the UN did intervene, it frequently unwittingly ended up supporting the goal of ethnic separation, because what the UN did, kind of taking a page out of the Operation Lifeline Sudan playbook, is it set up a number of safe zones, or so-called safe zones, where refugees could flee to escape the fighting. There would be some peacekeepers on the ground in those safe zones, and there would be humanitarian aid. It would be something. However, those kind of had almost a magnetic effect of drawing those who were afraid of being victims of ethnic violence to those enclaves, those safe havens, which is what Croats, Serbs, and others were looking to do to ethnically cleanse those areas. And there was, of course, the failures to sometimes provide the protections that was offered. So the most horrific act of violence, I believe, was 1995, the so-called Srebrenica massacre. I don't know if it shows up on these maps, and it's alright if it doesn't. I don't want to belabor the point too much, but Srebrenica was one of the safe havens that the UN had set up, and it appointed Dutch peacekeepers to protect that area. And it was a majority Muslims who were fleeing into the area to get away from the Serbs. Serbs surrounded the city. Overcast, cloudy, stormy weather kept the NATO aircraft from attacking the Serbs, and the Serbs gave the Dutch peacekeepers a choice, if you can call it that. The Dutch soldiers and the women could leave, or the Serbs would attack them all. And so the Dutch took the deal, and 8,000 Muslim men and boys were killed in the ethnic cleansing which followed in Srebrenica. So, if that sounds like a success, it would be hard to imagine a failure. Members of the Clinton administration were finally able to, in 1995, hammer out the Dayton Accords, named for Dayton, Ohio, where they were finally negotiated. Former well-known American diplomat, a guy named Richard or Dick Holbrooke, was instrumental in getting those Dayton Accords through. But it was too late for those who had already been killed, whether it be the victims of the ethnic cleansing carried out by all sides, or if it was those civilians who had been killed by the NATO airstrikes, which, again, ironically, were being done to try to put a halt to the killing of civilians. So, this is the conflict where the term ethnic cleansing is coined. Again, it had been going on for millennia, but now we had a new term to describe what was going on. So, that's that omission. I hope you see now why it's important. Haiti, I don't know what happened here. We're going to leave this area. We're going to go to Haiti. So notice that Haiti and the Dominican Republic share the same island, right? What's the issue here? Well, the issue here is post-election violence. In 1991, Haiti had its first free and fair election, which brought Jean-Baptiste Aristide to power. There was no civil war in Haiti that would have justified a UN intervention. But what had happened was Aristide was run out of the country, largely by the security forces in Haiti. Now, the Security Council, which even though they're not terribly successful, the Security Council has a tendency to prefer to impose sanctions when this kind of stuff happens. But the U.S. was opposed because it was worried that sanctions in Haiti was going to lead to an outflow of what we might call, although they're not legally a recognized category, economic refugees, who would end up where? In Florida, in the United States. And there's also a not so veiled racial concern in the United States about Haitians showing up in large numbers, fleeing perhaps sanctions that the United States put on it. So the United States might owe some sort of moral obligation to those who were fleeing from the effects of a policy it had a hand in crafting. Even though the U.S. was not a fan of them, it did prefer it at first to a direct intervention, which the U.S. was not interested in doing. And the sanctions ended up having the unintended consequence of ending the previous 20 to 30 years of investment in Haiti. And a number of those businesses that were going to be affected either by the first or the spillover effects of those sanctions, they just moved across the island and set up shop in the Dominican Republic. So there's a tremendous economic fallout as a result of those sanctions placed on the country. And Aristide, who was in exile, requested that the sanctions be applied until he was restored to power and then to call them off. The U.S. then begins to push for a UN intervention in Haiti before the situation deteriorates further. And then there's a large influx of Haitian refugees into the United States. The U.S. calculus now is that an intervention in Haiti will stabilize the political situation there, it will improve the economic situation, and there won't be a large outflux of Haitians. So the UN responding to that, and with the United States' full support at kind of the height of American power, the UN authorizes a multinational force that's led by the United States to restore President Aristide to power. Aristide promises he's going to try to build up the civilian security forces, the civilian police. The United Nations would step in and oversee the elections, believing that it was really important to restore democracy in that country, especially since UN forces were operating there. The UN didn't want to be viewed as a kind of imperial power in its own right and wanted to have democratic legitimacy or democratic governance going on while it was intervening in Haiti. The UN would go on to provide technical assistance in trying to develop the Haitian National Police. And if you know Haiti, you know that I believe it's still holding the unfortunate title of the poorest country per person in the Western Hemisphere. And Haiti has had almost nothing but bad luck. I'm not going to say since this, but along with this, of course, there was the earthquake, other natural events, political instability returned. There have been a lot of issues in Haiti subsequently, and the political situation was frequently touch and go for a while. Probably. Right. So Rwanda is 1994. It's probably the most famous of UN interventions, perhaps ever. UN peacekeeping operations. So what are we talking about? All right, we're out of here, and we're into the Great Lakes. Different Great Lakes. So not the Great Lakes in the United States. This is the Great Lakes region. Oops. Well, here we'll center it. Rwanda is a very small country, and sometimes when people know about the Rwandan genocide, it's like, wow, that must have been a huge place. It wasn't. It still isn't a huge place. But anyways, it's sometimes known as the Great Lakes region of Africa. Anyways, Rwanda. Rwanda had formerly been a colony of the Belgians, and there is still is, but there was an ethnic division to the country. Broadly, there were two groups, Hutu and Tutsi. The Hutu were the majority of the population, but as colonizers, what the Belgians did, which is what a lot of colonizers do, is they go to a sizable minority population and they put them in charge because a fairly large minority is not large enough to maintain itself without the support of an outsider. In this case, it would be the colonial power. And they put it in leadership positions, put in charge of security forces, and so on. And so the Tutsi were frequently associated with colonialism. And make matters worse, the Belgians pull out when they decide to end that colonial enterprise. They pull out quite rapidly before there was much of a stable government in place. And Rwanda had, unfortunately, experienced a history of political violence, post-independence, coup d'etats, and so forth. However, in the early 90s, kind of right up until the genocide, the UN had actually been pointing to Rwanda as an example of what happens when peacekeeping goes right. You talk about your tragedies here. I mean, once you know where that story is going, you can see the irony of slapping that label on earlier. But it really was believed that peacekeeping was working in Rwanda. I guess the short version will do. Yeah, this is actually the short version, believe it or not. 1994, the Hutu decide to launch an attack on the Tutsis. And of course, it was a little bit more complicated. There's talk of also attacking moderate Hutu, which presumably are defined as someone who married a Tutsi or lived with them or was friends with them, or just wasn't for the genocide enough. So the Hutu began massacring the Tutsis. Now, to make matters even more complicated, there was a Tutsi military force, the RPF, and they weren't in Rwanda initially to do anything about the genocide. They were there. They've been operating in Uganda as well, as the borders there, they're there on the map, but in reality, they were easily traversable. And so the Tutsi-dominated RPF is the one that ends up being the force that goes after those who commit genocide. and that's the largely Hutu population, and begin to push the Hutu in the Hutu army of Rwanda largely into the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they're going to end up regrouping and then launching attacks back into Rwanda. And that conflict is going to end up greatly destabilizing eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is going to now go through its own civil war on and off, in which there are high estimates, something too high, that about 6 million people have been killed in that. But just to the conflict here in Rwanda, there were about 800,000 Tutsi and Hutu as well who were killed in the span of about 100 days. Where was the UN? Where was the others? Well, they were actually in Rwanda. And they were warned in advance that something's going on. There was a Canadian leader, Romeo Dallaire. It's a pretty memorable name. And he had wired UN headquarters and told them, we have Hutus, they're stockpiling machetes and other weapons prior to the outbreak of the genocide. And ironically, the person who he contacted back at the Department of Peacekeeping Operations is a guy named Kofi Annan. Now, if you don't know anything about the UN, the name doesn't mean anything to you. But Kofi Annan is going to, in the future, go on to become the Secretary General of the United Nations. But Annan doesn't reply to Dallaire. What Dallaire wants to do is he wants the authority to go and seize these weapons stockpiles before something bad happens. But he's never given that authorization. The UN peacekeepers are authorized to use force if their lives are in danger, if they are attacked. They don't have permission to use force to protect the lives of others. That's the mandate. So when the fighting breaks out, what the UN largely does is it withdraws its peacekeepers. Or they're not really the UNs, they're operating under the label of the UN, but they belong to the national militaries who have lent them for the purpose of these peacekeeping operations. And so what little force there is removed. So another pop culture reference. Again, I don't do many of them, so enjoy them while they last. But Hotel Rwanda, the movie Don Cheadle is among the names in that one. That actually, there's a lot to that movie that is true. I mean, it tends to focus on one individual, but that can still give you a sense as to what was going on. Not a movie that's going to put you in a terribly good mood, but sometimes learning stuff doesn't always make you happier in the short term. Sometimes ignorance might be bliss, but we can't exactly make that the motto of a institution of higher education. Anyways, the genocide goes on for 100 days, 800,000 people killed. It's only put to an end because the Tutsi RPF ends up fighting, killing, and displacing those who are carrying out the genocide. And then, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that it just leads to a whole new round of destabilization and ongoing civil war in which millions die later. All right, I'm almost done with this spirit building lecture here. Kosovo. Not quite back to where we started, but back to where we were a little while ago. I mentioned Kosovo. So I think, maybe that's the easiest to see. So Kosovo's got these dash lines because it's not quite clear whether it's a country yet or if it's just an autonomous region within Serbia, which it had been. Kosovo claims to be independent. Serbia claims it's not. It's nuts, as they say. What is it? It's a whole big thing. All right. So, but anyways, you know where it is on a map now, and if you don't, again, look again. There it is. Okay, Kosovo. These folks not happy that they didn't get their own state in the Dayton Accords. Actually, Kosovo Albanians began to carry out insurgent attacks against the Serbs in Kosovo. They claim that the Serbs are oppressing them in Kosovo, treating them poorly, second-class citizens, all that stuff. And they want independence. Serbs respond. So again, we're talking about the Serbs respond quite violently to the insurgency, as counterinsurgents frequently do. And conflict breaks out. And there's once again a kind of religious component to this, with, depending on where in Serbia, but factions of Christians attacking largely, not exclusively, but largely Muslim population in Kosovo. And the West wants to intervene on behalf of the Kosovars, particularly the Albanians in Kosovo. Again, there's a desire to intervene, but not at great cost to those who intervene. And so there is this war that's fought by the United States and other allied air forces, largely, against the Serbs, who use a kind of punishment strategy against the Serbs, going after civilian as well as military targets, until the Serbs decide to leave Kosovo alone. And that's going to take some time to do, but it is done. It does not get Security Council authorization, so it's not a UN mission in Kosovo. So it is kind of an outlier in that title. The reason why is that the Russians and the Chinese are against it, and they would veto the resolution that would have called for it. And they're opposed to it for different reasons. The Russians historically have good relations with the Serbs, and they saw this as kind of an attack. Well, it was an attack on the Serbs, and so they would have opposed it for that reason. Also, the Russians are going to begin regaining their strength, though he's not in power yet. This guy Vladimir Putin is about to come to power in Russia, and he'll begin reshaping things. And the Chinese are opposed to this because they're wary of setting any sort of example whereby the UN or outside powers have the excuse to intervene to help minority groups who claim oppression from larger, more powerful majority groups, because China is, in its own way, already its own empire, right? In the sense that it governs over a fair amount of non-Chinese, whether it be the Tibetans in the south, whether it be the Muslim population in Xinjiang. There are the issues with Taiwan and Hong Kong about how much autonomy and independence they ought to have. So China's wary on all those grounds of these things, and they both have the ability to veto or to stop this action. And so rather than have it fail at the UN, NATO takes it on itself. And so this is a NATO operation, which it does get the Serbs to agree to knock off a lot of the attacks in Kosovo, though what exactly was going to come later was not clearly determined. And that's why we have some dispute about whether Kosovo is a state or not, whether it had the right to do that and so on. I'm not worried about that. We're not looking at that. We're looking at humanitarian crises and interventions, and particularly the role of the UN and other IGOs and other actors in those interventions. It's this event, which is the last one in our outline, that's going to lead the UN in the early to mid 2000s to outline an idea known as a concept as the responsibility to protect. And this term is going to come up in your reading later. But the argument is that most of the time it's a state government's job to protect its own people. If it's unwilling or unable to do so, then others have a responsibility to get involved. And some people claim that the UN, the first application of that was in Libya during the Arab Spring, when there was a fear that the then leader of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, was going to carry out kind of horrific violence against his own people, and so there was an intervention to undo him and to deny him that possibility. But there have not been that many applications of the responsibility to protect. What exactly it entails, whether it's a good or a bad thing, those are still active questions of academic debate. But beyond the scope of what we have to talk about here, I've covered everything I wanted to. So I'm ready to cut it off here. We're going to somewhat different things in the next few lectures. I mean, it's not a huge pivot, but there is a pivot here to non-governmental organizations, which I've talked about, mentioned several times this evening. We're also going to move into and talk about human rights, which may have sounded like I did, but I've mostly been talking about humanitarian rights this evening. So we'll talk about human rights in another lecture. If you need greater clarification on any of this stuff, feel free to swing by office hours. Is the best place to do it. All right. Thanks very much, folks.